Muchas gracias, Honorable Minister, distinguished leaders of this remarkable organization. I've been listening to all the talks that have been given this morning. I also saw the video earlier in the day, which showed all the remarkable things that CUMIPAZ is doing. And I must say this is an extremely impressive initiative, which I hope will grow, not only in this region of the world, but perhaps globally. And I want to say right at the outset, if there's anything I can do to help in your plans and their implementation, I would treat it as a great privilege and an opportunity which I hope will be of some value to humanity. I also want to clarify right at the beginning that I'm no longer chairman of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I served in that position for 13 years, from 2002 to 2015, for 13 years. And since then, I have been involved in other global initiatives, which I will tell you a little bit about. And I'm sorry that I'm speaking in English in a region where, really speaking, my heart is feeling more and more at home. I think Latin America and all the Spanish-speaking countries, of course Brazil, which is Portuguese-speaking, is a region where I believe you have arrived at a wonderful union of development objectives and what is important for the growth of the human spirit. I think it is vitally important that we treat development as something that provides human beings happiness and make sure that this planet Earth, Pachamama, is protected. And this is where I would say corporate social responsibility has to come to grips with the larger objective of creating happiness for human society. It's not enough only to maximize profits and make money. After all, that is not the only objective of living. It may be an important part of what we all want to do, but we should never lose sight of the overall objective. So I'm basically going to give you some findings from the 5th assessment report of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And if we're talking about peace, if we're talking about happiness, then the knowledge that has been created by the IPCC as contained in the 5th assessment report is something that has to become an important part of corporate global responsibility. So let me start with the first slide. And here I must say a few things about the economics profession. I'm an economist myself. I started my career as an engineer and then decided to get a PhD in industrial engineering and in economics. And for the last 30 years, of course, I've been involved in work related to climate change because I was very deeply moved by the science of climate change, which convinced me that for human society, this is going to be the biggest challenge that we're going to face in the 21st century. Now, there are various views of economics. Milton Friedman, who was the high priest of neoclassical economics, and someone who believed that the free market couldn't make any mistakes. If you asked him about corporate social responsibility, his response was that maximizing the profits and the benefits for the shareholders is the biggest form of corporate social responsibility. And I don't know if anybody agrees with that. But fortunately, that view has been challenged. And it's been challenged by two gurus in economics who I hold in high esteem. One was Dr. Nicholas Georgescu-Roegen, who I had the privilege of knowing personally. He was a good friend. And the other was Kenneth Boulding. Now, these are two people who should have got the Nobel Prize in economics, but they never did because they went against the stream. They were swimming against the tide. And they were brave people. They were visionaries who looked ahead. And Kenneth Boulding was absolutely right, that we are all residents of spaceship Earth. Whatever waste you produce remains in spaceship Earth. It doesn't get thrown out into outer space. And we are all part of what you might call a closed economic system. So we are responsible to society just as society is responsible to us if you're in the corporate sector. A good friend of mine who was president of the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, Bjorn Stigson, used to say, business cannot succeed in a society which fails. And we see the failure of society all around us. So you can imagine that's obviously going to impact in the form of failure of business as well. So we are all residents of spaceship Earth. We are all responsible for the maintenance, the conservation of the ecosystems of this planet, because this is the only planet we have. There is no planet B. We are all responsible to planet A. This is the only planet we have. And I want to say that there are good impacts of economic activity and corporate actions, and there are bad impacts. The bad impacts, and I'll explain that in detail, are in the form of climate change, in the form of all the waste that we are creating. If you go to Google, you can look up the fate of a beautiful island in the Pacific called Henderson Island. This is supposed to be a World Heritage Site. And it gets millions of tons of waste, including plastic waste, which is generated at the southern tip of South America. And it goes all the way and deposits on this particular island. So we have no escape. Every part of this globe is going to be affected by everything we do in every other part of the globe. So we have to keep that in mind. And the negative externalities that we see today are growing very rapidly. And this is inevitable because the population of this earth has grown enormously. At the beginning of the last century, can you imagine what the population of this world was? 1.3 billion. In 1 century, it increased to 6.2 billion. Today, it is in excess of 7.3 billion. Where will it stabilize? 9.5, 10, maybe 11 billion? And if everybody is going to consume like your neighbors to the north in the United States, or even parts of this society, we certainly will not be able to manage with one planet. You will have to find a bigger planet than the Earth, and maybe all of us will have to move there. And there won't be any Panama Canal that will take us over there. We'll have to find some other technology of getting there. And there is the tragedy of the commons, because the atmosphere belongs to nobody. But it affects everybody. So if you increase the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, if you ruin the oceans, all of us are responsible, but we are not accountable. We don't have to account for it. If we dump things in the oceans, who penalizes us? Who holds us responsible? So what has happened is that the global commons, which sustain life, on which our own existence depends, have now got polluted to an extent that all the negative externalities of what we do, what we produce, what we consume, are now affecting these global commons in the form of climate change, in the form of biodiversity loss. And the loss of biodiversity is a very serious issue, not only on land, but also in the oceans. The marine oceans, the marine waters that we have across the globe, all the oceans are now suffering a major loss of ecosystems and marine life. And we don't even know enough about it. This is an area which is not researched adequately. So what we need to do is to bridge the gap between private and social. What is good for private individuals, private organizations, must be good for society. Because if you have them going in opposite directions, at some point, society will suffer. It is already suffering. And it won't be too long before the private sector also suffers. Now, I want to refer to something very interesting that has happened. This year, the Nobel Prize for Economics has gone to a person called Richard Taylor. He is a person who has worked on what you call behavioral economics. And although he's from the University of Chicago, he doesn't believe in what Milton Friedman used to say. He is talking about the fact that consumers can be nudged, that means they can be pushed a little bit, to consume differently. And to my mind, this concept is very powerful, because this means that public policy can influence consumption decisions, and particularly private consumption decisions. And this gives you hope, because this means that not everybody has to live like an American. We can live differently. We can live in harmony with nature. We can respect Pachamama. And if we do that, then clearly we might create a better world for our children and their children. And if we don't do that, then we are leaving an earth that obviously will make it very difficult for people to survive. So I would say that the economics profession has to move quickly in the direction of what Richard Taylor has been working on, and in the direction in which a large number of ecological economists are now working. Now, this profession of ecological economists was not known 30 or 40 years ago. It is growing very rapidly. And this profession must enter into corporate decision making. Corporate organizations have to be responsible for ensuring that the ecology of this planet is not destroyed. Now let me go to something very direct and straightforward. The United Nations has accepted these 17 Sustainable Development Goals in 2015. And if you look at all of them, they have a direct relationship and a direct link with corporate activity. Poverty. I mean, if people are poor, you're not going to sell anything to them. If you look at other aspects, and I don't want to go through the whole lot, but certainly, if you look at energy, we need sustainable energy for all. If you look at life below the ocean, life below water, then if the oceans are ruined, can you imagine the large number of hundreds of millions of people whose lives are dependent on resources from the oceans, fishing, for instance? They are going to be affected. So we have a direct link with corporate activities and these Sustainable Development Goals. And I would request every corporate organization to make this an important part of their own activities. Because if you serve these Sustainable Development Goals, you would also be serving your responsibility as a corporate organization to society. I want to tell you about the fifth assessment report of the IPCC. Now, President Trump has been saying that climate change is a hoax. I mean, some may respond by saying that the presidency of the United States is a hoax. But the truth is that climate science and what the climate scientists have found is so profound, it's so well established, that there is no room for doubt at all. And I always tell remarkable audiences like this that President Trump says that climate change is a Chinese conspiracy. Well, if that's the case, then I should be a Chinese citizen. And I'm not. I regard myself as a citizen of the world. I'm as much a citizen of Panama, as of Mexico, as of India, because what we need is a vision of global citizenship. We are not here only to get benefits for ourselves. We have to make sure that we also protect this planet. Now, I want to tell you this because the IPCC, which I'm not responsible for anymore, but I was for 13 years, and I can say that with a great deal of pride, mobilizes the most outstanding scientists from all over the world to give us what is the real state of the climate and the science of climate change. Now, it functions in 3 working groups. The first working group deals with the physical science basis, the second with impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability, and the third with mitigation of climate change. And I'm just going to focus on one working group so that you get a clear idea of what a gigantic scientific effort this is. There is no effort anywhere in the world, in the history of the human race, where scientific knowledge has been brought together on such a scale that leaves you with no doubt at all about what human beings are doing to the climate of this planet. Working Group 1 had 259 authors. These are the people who actually write the report of Working Group 1. They were from 39 countries. And at each stage of the draft of the report, the draft is sent out to expert reviewers and to governments. And they provide comments on every part of the draft. And these comments have to be carefully studied by all the authors, and they have to record whether they agree with the comment or disagree with it. If they disagree with it, they have to give reasons why they disagree with it. And look at the number of scientific publications that were cited for just one part of this report. 9,200 scientific publications. These have to be studied by the authors. I'm sorry, I'm giving you all these details because I want to tell you that there is nothing more convincing, nothing more definite than the findings of the IPCC with respect to climate change. Climate change is for real. Let's not doubt it. If we doubt it, we are being dishonest. We are being intellectually, politically, and morally dishonest. And you may be the highest office holder in the most powerful country in the world. But if you are doubting the science of climate change, I'm sorry. You are being totally dishonest, and you're doing a great disservice to human society. This is something we must keep in mind. So I just wanted to give you this dimension because in the 21st century, it is very important that we move on the basis of knowledge. This century is regarded as the century of knowledge. But knowledge can be harmful. Knowledge can also be very valuable to human society. Knowledge of the nuclear bomb, as we can see, can be very harmful. Since this is a grouping that's concerned with peace, we are really on the edge at this point of time. Anything can go wrong. North Korea has a nuclear bomb. It has delivery capabilities. There are other parts of the world where, quite apart from nuclear arms, they also have a huge amount of weaponry which can destroy this world over several times. So you have harmful knowledge as well. And I think we have to make sure that we use human wisdom and the moral strength that human society has by which we get rid of these weapons. They are not helping anybody, and they're only leading to conflicts in different parts of the world. Who benefits from it? The manufacturers and the marketers of weaponry. They are the only ones who benefit from it. It causes huge misery to human society. So I would say, please treat knowledge as the foundation for taking decisions in the 21st century. I won't go into this. This is just to tell you that the 5,000 plus pages of the IPCC reports are condensed into something called the synthesis report. I will only request that those of you who have an interest, please go to the IPCC website and read the 31 pages of what is called the summary for policymakers. If you read that, then you understand the reality of climate change, and you don't need to learn anything more. It's called the summary for policymakers, and the IPCC website is ipcc.ch. CH, of course, for Switzerland, because that's where the Secretariat is located. What are the key messages of the fifth assessment report? Well, firstly, human influence on the climate system is quite clear, and I've said that now. The more we disrupt our climate, the more we risk severe, pervasive, and irreversible impacts. Just to give you an example, sea level rise is an irreversible impact. Once the sea level rises, you can't tell the sea to go down all over again. And if you look at Panama City, if you look at the Republic of Panama, clearly sea level rise is something that you would be very concerned about. And this is true of many nations across the globe. It's true of the 3 dozen small island states, many of which will vanish. I was with President Nasheed, former president of the Maldives Islands, where you have over 1,000 islands in this nation, and most of them are just about 1 meter high. So sea level rise is a major threat for them, because every time there is a storm surge, every time you have something like Hurricane Harvey, as you've seen, I mean, Houston was completely underwater. You've seen what has happened to Puerto Rico. The extent of damage is just enormous. Now, if the sea was a little lower, then the extent of damage would not be so high. So this is an irreversible impact. Fortunately, we have the means to limit climate change and build a more prosperous, sustainable future. How can we do that? We use knowledge again. Today, you have knowledge of technologies. You have knowledge of the consequences of not doing something about climate change. And I think this is what should motivate us to take the right steps and create a more prosperous and sustainable future. One important point I think we should keep in mind is that the current model of economic development is causing huge disparities, huge differences, not only across societies, but also within societies. Earlier this year, Oxfam released its report in which it said that there are 8 people in the world, only 8 people, who have as much wealth as half the population of this planet. Can you believe it? 8 individuals have as much wealth as 3.7 billion people in this world. What kind of an economic system are we creating? Is this not explosive? Is this not going to lead to enormous human hardship all over the world, which will not leave any of us alone? We will all be affected by it. So we have the means. Let us use those means by which we create a brighter future for ourselves, this planet, our children, and their children. If you look at how humans are changing the climate, this is a plot of the change in temperature since the beginning of industrialization. And of course, there are fluctuations which are the result of human actions and natural activities like solar activity, volcanic activity, and so on. But see how rapidly the temperature has increased since the middle of the last century. And we've got a statement at the top which says it is extremely likely that we are the dominant cause of warming since the mid-20th century. And when we use the term extremely likely, we are assigning a probability of over 95%. to this statement. That means we are 95% sure that since the middle of the last century, we have been responsible for the change in temperature, the change in climate, and the warming that has taken place. So this is something that should concern us all, and I'll say more about this. This is how sea level has increased. The sea level has increased because all the bodies of ice across the globe are melting, and there is thermal expansion of the oceans with warming that takes place. How much has been the average increase in sea level? Well, since the beginning of the last century, up to 2010, it has been 19 centimeters. That's almost a foot. And a lot of countries in the world may not worry about it. Switzerland won't worry about it because they're far away from the ocean and they're at a height where this won't affect us. But look at the number of countries that would be affected by this. And it's not stopping here. Sea level rise is continuing. So we have to make sure that we contain this increase and that we take action. What has led to climate change as a result of human actions? And I talked earlier about the global commons. We have increased the concentration of greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere. What you see over here, the green line, is carbon dioxide. At the beginning of industrialization, there were 280 parts per million in the atmosphere of carbon dioxide. Today, it is more than 400 parts per million. So that's not sustainable. We have to contain that. We have to stop that. The next line is methane, and the lowermost line is nitrous oxide. So we have to make sure that we do something about this problem, otherwise it will go totally out of control. Where does carbon dioxide come from? The dark portion is the result of emissions due to burning of fossil fuels, cement production, and flaring of natural gas. And the yellow portion is forestry and other land uses, deforestation basically. And this is happening all over the world, including in the Amazon region. So what we really need to do is to make sure that we reduce the burning of fossil fuels, use energy more efficiently, make sure that area under forests is increased, and thereby we might be able to make a difference for the future of climate on this planet. And some of the changes in extreme weather and climate events observed since about 1950 have been linked to human influence. We see many more extreme events taking place now. We brought out a special report in the IPCC in 2011 where we estimated how these extreme events are increasing. There's been an increase in hurricane activity in the northern Atlantic region. There has been an increase in extreme precipitation events. That means heavy rainfall in a short period of time. There's been an increase in heat waves and dry weather. You see all the forest fires in California, in other parts like Spain and Portugal. They have forest fires right now, and it's happened in several parts of the world. In Australia, even in Russia. So we have to be concerned about these extreme events. Climate change is not only a warming of the temperature. Climate change is what you might call a complete disruption of the climate system and the stability of the climate system. And it's happening from the tropics to the poles, on all the continents and in the ocean. It affects rich and poor countries. It affects the United States, a rich country like the United States. The state of Florida, for instance. With climate change, what's going to happen is that President Trump's estate in Florida will be underwater in his lifetime. It won't be after his lifetime. So, you know, the impacts are going to affect rich and poor people. Of course, the poor suffer much more. Because if you have a hurricane in Florida, people get early warning, they board up their windows, they get into their SUVs or their pickup trucks and move away. What happens when a similar hurricane or cyclone hits Bangladesh? It's a very densely populated country, very low-lying, very poor. People lose their lives, they lose their homes. They have nowhere to go. And you know, the extent of damage is much higher. So, of course, it affects the poor much worse, but if it does have impacts on rich and poor alike. And what are the projected changes in climate that we see and their implications? Oceans will continue to warm during the 21st century, and that has major implications for fishery stocks and so on. If you are getting fish of a certain species close to Panama, it's inevitable that over a period of time, these stocks will move elsewhere where they can survive. And maybe other forms of fish will take their place, but it will affect the current pattern of fishing and the current pattern of resources coming from the oceans. It's very likely that the Arctic sea ice cover will continue to shrink and thin as global mean surface temperature rises. And I've been to the Arctic region many times, and you can almost see how sea ice cover is being reduced. And I want to give you one prediction. If we don't do anything about climate change, then in September 2050, there will be no ice cover on the Arctic Ocean. Can you imagine? The Arctic Ocean, which you know is covered by ice literally round the year, will have no ice cover at all in September 2050. And that will have major implications, not only for that region, but also other parts of the world. And global mean sea level will continue to rise during the 21st century. Again, if we don't take action, then sea level rise by the end of the century will be 98 centimeters. That means a meter. And several island states will be gone. The Caribbean region will be severely affected, and possibly parts of Panama as well. So this is something to worry about. In fact, DNV GL, a large company that is into a number of marine activities, the former CEO told me that they've probably carried out a study of the Panama Canal and how this is going to be affected as a result of sea level rise. I haven't read that study, but it may be worth looking at. And global glacier volume will further decrease. So glaciers across the globe are melting very rapidly, and I think we need to be concerned about that. There will be water and food shortages, and I'm very glad that I'm getting a glass of water. Thank you. Thank you very much. And there'll be increased poverty, because one of the impacts of climate change will be on agriculture. Agricultural yields will go down. So small farmers all over the world are going to suffer. It's already started happening. So therefore, we need to be concerned about increased poverty. There'll be increased displacement of people. And I keep telling people in Europe, you have seen nothing of the refugee crisis yet. I mean, it's a serious problem for Europe because so many refugees from Syria and elsewhere have moved into Europe. But with climate change, the displacement of people will increase enormously. And where will they go? They will risk their lives and go to places which are doing relatively well in economic terms. There'll also be coastal flooding, because with sea level rise and increase in hurricane activity, you can imagine coastal flooding will become much worse in the years ahead. Look at what happened with Hurricane Harvey, 2017. This is on a street where boats were running. So this kind of thing will become very common. And you'll also find that insurance for anything close to the beach, close to the sea, will become very expensive, if not impossible. So as oceans rise, insurers will run away. They will not insure property, they will not insure anything that is close to the sea, because they have to stay in business. And I can tell you, of all the corporate entities, the insurance industry is most sensitive to climate change, because their business decisions are intimately linked with what would happen in terms of risk in some of these areas. So we need to be aware of that. And there are other economic implications. This is a news report from this year, the summer. It was too hot for planes to get off the ground in Arizona. Can you imagine? That's because the air was so rarefied because of the heat that the planes, jet planes, would not have been able to take off. And this has economic implications. Now, if you look at the impacts of, let's say, Hurricane Harvey, the estimate is that all the damage that took place in Houston will probably cost more than $200 billion plus. You know what happened with Superstorm Sandy when New York was completely flooded. At least $150 billion were lost. Now what's going to happen to Puerto Rico and San Juan? I mean, everything is destroyed over there. People don't have electricity, they don't have water. It really means rebuilding all the infrastructure of that place. God knows how much it will cost. So the economic implications of climate change are one good reason why corporate sector executives and decision makers must realize that you cannot make money in a condition where the climate of this world is changing and the impacts are becoming much worse. Look at this, ice deposit in a desert. This has happened, it's not made up. This has happened in the United Arab Emirates, it has happened in Saudi Arabia. So these freak events are going to become far more common. And what do we do now? I mean, right at the start I said we can create a more prosperous and sustainable future. If we want to limit temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius by the end of this century, as specified in the Paris Agreement on climate change, we will have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40 to 70% in 2050 compared to 2010 values. And can this region do it? If we are committed to peace, can we become the examples? Can we become the models for the rest of the world to bring about that change? My son, Dr. Ash Pachauri, and I have been working with the mayor of Mexico City to see that we create a roadmap for a clean energy future. And I salute him for his vision, because he's really eager to move to a clean energy future. And Mexico has enormous opportunities because it's got large areas of land, very good wind speeds, very good solar energy intake, and therefore it's entirely possible for that country to move in a big way to the use of renewable energy. So by the end of the century, we'll have to reduce emissions to zero or negative values. How do we reach negative values? Well, one way is to have a much larger area of forest in the world, because forests absorb carbon dioxide. We'll also need to develop technologies for carbon capture and storage. And global emissions will have to curb very quickly. We don't have the luxury of time. We have to move very quickly to bring about these changes. And yes, there is a vested interest on the part of some industries, some businesses, and I can tell you they'll do everything to stop people like me from preaching what I'm trying to say right now. The fossil fuel industry would not want to change, although some of them are changing, as I'll show you. So I think we need to move very quickly, even if people tell you that climate change is a hoax, and even if they tell you that climate change is going to be something that will cost a lot of money to solve. That's absolute nonsense. We can do it at very low cost, and I'll say a little more about that. We need to use energy more efficiently. We become a very wasteful society. And we need to use low carbon and no carbon energy on a large scale. And fortunately, a lot of these technologies exist already, and they're developing very rapidly. We need improved carbon sinks, more forest area, no deforestation, carbon capture and storage technologies, use of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And we need changes in lifestyles. Now, this is where the Nobel Prize for Economics for this year becomes very important. Because if you're talking about behavioral economics, then I think if we change the behavior of human beings, then business will also change. And one of the things that I have no hesitation in saying to an audience like this, please eat less meat, because meat is very intensive in the emissions of greenhouse gases. And if you eat less meat, I always say, you'll be healthier and so would the planet. Now, I became a vegetarian about 20 years ago, and I'm not saying that you have to follow what I'm doing, but I can tell you I've never felt better. I feel much healthier because I'm on a vegetarian diet. And if you don't believe me, then I'll take you to an elephant. He'll tell you that he feels fine with a vegetarian diet. And if you still don't believe me, then I'll take you to a racehorse. See how much energy he has. That guy lives on a vegetarian diet. If you still don't believe me, then I'll take you to a species that has an alimentary canal and a system just like ours. And that guy is called a gorilla. He lives on a vegetarian diet. So I can tell you that eating less meat is healthy for you. It's also healthy for the planet. But that's not the only thing. We have become very wasteful. We buy things, we just use them a few times and then throw them away. And where does it go? We are all on spaceship Earth. It remains within this closed system. And it has very serious and negative impacts. Let's get out of that. Happiness does not consist only of consumption. Yes, a poor man needs some basic things. He has to consume food, he has to buy some clothes, he has to have a house. But we have gone far beyond that. Happiness consists of much more. Most importantly, it consists of human relationships. And this region, I can say, is unique because you have traditions, you have values that place a great deal of emphasis on human relationships, whether it's in the family, with friends, with others outside, and that is the essence of human happiness. And I think if the corporate sector practices that, then I think we are in good hands. So this is something that we need to keep in mind. Now, if you say that renewable energy is very expensive, this region of China ran on renewable energy for an entire week. Can you imagine? For one full week. I want to give you another example. Small city called Palo Alto in California uses only renewable energy. And they're doing very well. Of course, it's a small city. But, you know, the fact that they can do it, it can be done elsewhere also. And I was just talking a few weeks ago to the State Secretary of Energy from Germany. And they're commissioning a large offshore wind farm. And he says, for the first time, we are not providing any subsidies. The private developers are going to supply that electricity at the same rate as fossil fuel-based power. So that means today, these are really very attractive options, as I'll show you. Look at the cost of energy based on realized load factors. The black line is coal and coal-based power, and the brown line is solar energy, and the blue line is onshore wind. You see how rapidly prices are changing? At this rate, if you have to make an investment decision, you have to look 15, 20, 30 years into the future. Would you invest in something that's going to be more expensive than the new technology that's available? Of course not. So I think this is something that we have to keep in mind. And I want to tell you about this year, for the first time, there's been more investment in renewable energy than in nuclear power. So in my view, nuclear power is going out. It's not going to be economically viable in the future. And you'll have much better renewable energy options. I also want to show you this company called Dong Energy. Dong Energy is in Denmark, is the Danish oil and natural gas company. And they have switched over from fossil fuels completely to renewable energy. So can you imagine an entire fossil fuel-based company moving into renewable energy? This is a major change. Now, this is an important issue that I want to bring to your attention. If at the beginning of industrialization, we had to estimate how much we could emit by way of carbon dioxide, then we would have come up with an estimate of 2,900 gigatons if temperature increase by the end of this century was to be kept below 2 degrees Celsius. Now by 2011, we had used up 1,900 gigatons already. And if you look at the estimate today, it's probably 2,100 gigatons. So all we have left is about 800 gigatons. And this will get consumed very fast. So you will end up with a temperature increase of more than 2 degrees Celsius. And that would play havoc. Because if climate change is causing so much harm, so much disaster today, can you imagine what would happen with an excess of temperature of 2 degrees Celsius? So we have very limited time. We have to move very quickly. That's the point of what I'm trying to say. And there will be those who will try to stop action in the right direction. And the example I want to give is of tobacco. The tobacco industry fought science for a long period of time. They said, no, tobacco doesn't cause any cancer. And the scientists who came up with these findings were ridiculed, they were attacked, and even their personal lives were destroyed. It's a fact. So the climate denial lobby is following exactly the same methods. And we have to fight it on the basis of knowledge that we have. I also want to say that the practice of observing CSR is extremely important because it gives you an external reputation. Today, with the rapid spread of information, people will find out if you're using child labor, if you're working under unsafe conditions, if your products are responsible for high emissions of greenhouse gases. All of that will become an important part of consumers' preferences. So examples of ethical practices are natural and organic materials, caring for the poor, caring for the disadvantaged, donations for a cause. And I think balancing shareholder interest versus social interest is an important part of corporate policy. And we need to look at long-term versus short-term. If you just make short-term profits and you ignore the long-term opportunities you have, you cannot stay in business very long. And you have to think of reasonable returns and shareholder satisfaction. But you have to assign value to reputational gain and strategic projections. And the emerging energy scenario is very clear. We have to move to greater use of renewable energy. We have to move to greater use of efficient methods of using energy, whether it's in transport or in homes and commercial complexes or whatever. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but you're aware of the UN Global Compact. Please look at this. I think this is something which the corporate sector has come up with under the umbrella of the United Nations. And I think if we follow the UN Global Compact, then I think we are serving the interests of the organization and of society. It deals with human rights, labor, environment, anti-corruption, all of which has been referred to in the talks earlier today. Now, finally, I want to come to something where I hope CUMIPAZ and we can enter into a partnership. I've launched something called the POP movement, which stands for Protect Our Planet. And I'm convinced that governments are not going to solve the problem of climate change. It's 25 years since the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change came into existence in Rio, in the famous Rio Summit, 1992. 25 years have gone by. We have still not dealt with the problem of climate change. So I think it is the youth of the world who have to take the lead, because it is their future which is going to be ruined. People who are 10, 15, 20 years old today are the ones who are going to face the worst impacts of climate change in the future. So we are now working with youth all over the world, and this is something called the POP movement, Protect Our Planet, by which we can make sure that we achieve sustainable development goals in schools, colleges, universities, and these young people can also then preach to adults. It can become an important part of the political agenda, so that those politicians who say they are not going to do anything about climate change will not be elected. Only those who commit action will be elected. And we need to mitigate climate change. We have to adapt to the impacts of climate change, because some impacts will continue, whatever we do today. So we'll have to adapt to them. So I would like to request you, this remarkable body, I want to ask you, can we join hands? Can we come into a partnership so that when you talk about peace, when you talk about corporate social responsibility, we work together, empower the youth. It'll take some modest resources, but you would be creating a better world, and your children and your grandchildren will be thankful to you. So this is what I want to say, and I think it's extremely important that corporate social responsibility takes into account the damage that we are doing to this planet, to Mother Earth, to Pachamama. And if we really want to make sure that we create conditions for human society by which everybody is happier, including the corporate sector, including decision makers who can feel proud of what they're doing, then it's very important for us to focus on the youth of this world. So I want to end here by giving you two quotations from Mahatma Gandhi, who incidentally, before I go to these quotations, said that those who are owners of capital are trustees on behalf of society. This is not your money. This is money that belongs to society. And society has placed trust in your hands. So you've got to use this money, you've got to use this capital for the benefit of society. That was his view of corporate social responsibility. And what he said is, speed is irrelevant if you're going in the wrong direction. What is the point of saying that we are growing at a GDP rate of growth of 5% or 6%, if in the bargain we are damaging all the ecosystems of this planet? That speed is irrelevant because you're going in the wrong direction. It's far better to grow at 2 or 3 or 1% while at the same time rebuilding the ecosystems of this planet. And he also said a technological society has two choices. First, it can wait until catastrophic failures expose systemic deficiencies, distortions, and self-deception. So either we can wait, oh, we'll see what happens, and you will have catastrophe overtaking us. Or secondly, a culture can provide social checks and balances to correct for systemic distortions prior to catastrophic failures. So today we have knowledge, we have our minds, we've got our brains, we've got our conscience. And if we were to exercise that, we'll say we'll do everything possible to avoid catastrophe. And I hope this applies even to decision making in politics. I hope the global community will do everything possible to save us from nuclear disaster or another war, because we have suffered enough. We cannot possibly recreate those conditions again. So my submission is, let us take knowledge seriously. Let us deal with climate change because it's going to affect all our lives. And if we can, let us work together. On behalf of the POP movement, I would like to seek a partnership with you so that we can do the best we are capable of for the benefit of the young generation and those yet to come. Muchas gracias. Thank you.